everybody. It's Wednesday, November 27th, coming at you a day early to make way for the holiday season. And I'd like to open the show by wishing all of you, our listeners, a most great and happy Thanksgiving. And you're in for a treat today because we have two guests that I know many of you will be very thankful for. It's a real first-time, long-time situation, but it's my pleasure to introduce the co-host of Citations Needed, Adam Johnson, and his co-author on the piece we will be discussing today, Othman Ali. Adam, Othman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having us.
All right. So I mentioned I wanted to have you on the show because you both wrote a piece in The Nation this week that I thought was very useful and did a very good job of sort of synthesizing the primary strategies by which the liberal or center-left media have employed to essentially distance Joe Biden and his administration from the horrors that we've seen take place in Palestine over the last year. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask you, starting with you, Adam, the ceasefire deal in Lebanon was announced the other day. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or like how the media has reacted to it, or what do you make of this ceasefire agreement that's supposedly been reached as it regards the Israeli invasion of Lebanon?
I mean, Israel was using collective punishment to just indiscriminately bomb Lebanon, specifically South Lebanon and South Beirut. And the political pressure to capitulate was too great for Hezbollah and its political confederates. So they did, because they were trying to decouple their support for Gaza. And Israel successfully did it by bombing a bunch of fucking apartment buildings for months on end. And there's only so much of that a population can take before they, they're just so asymmetrically outgunned. And so I think that eventually it worked. I mean, Israel doesn't necessarily have genocidal designs on Lebanon, although you could argue they do on South Lebanon. They really just wanted to keep punishing the civilians until they put political pressure to stop supporting Gaza, which they did, and it was successful. I don't pass judgment because, obviously I'm not in that situation. I've been to Beirut for all of 5 minutes, but it wasn't, certainly I have no authority to judge that decision, but I do think that's kind of was their thinking. And now they've decoupled it, and now they have full reign over, outside of the occasional, drone or spare bomb from Yemen or Iraq. They have pretty much a free reign to do in Gaza whatever they want, which they pretty much had anyway, but now it's gone from 98% to 99.9%.
And what can we say about the outlines of the ceasefire agreement such that it exists?
Basically, the Lebanese military, such that it takes over large sections of where Hezbollah was, and they stop lobbing missiles into Israel in solidarity with Gaza. I mean, it's pretty much the main take-home point. And part of Hezbollah's kind of moral authority was that they were one of the few military actors who was supporting Gaza rather than, writing op-eds in The Nation and other kind of futile actions. So, I mean, in that sense, I think it was fairly successful. And then I think there's other terms to be determined. I think it's kind of a generic outline right now.
So yeah, leaving Lebanon aside, because the focus of your piece is on Gaza, and just like I said, you outline in this piece, basically you categorize three different methods by which the mainstream journalism has sort of framed this conflict for an American audience. Adam, starting with you, and then Othman, could you talk a little bit about how the writing of this piece came together, and just sort of describe what your thesis statement is for how the mainstream, for lack of a better word, liberal media functions as a kind of press agent for Joe Biden and his Israel policy in a way that really makes it seem like it's all kind of out of his control.
Yeah, so it's part of a broader project that Othman and I are undertaking, which is basically trying to detail, especially the first year, we're trying to get a scope on it, how liberal or center-left media helped sell the genocide in Gaza, which we think is important because it's sort of taken for granted that Fox News and Trump MAGA media is going to kind of do the mindless racism, what they're going to do. But to really sell a genocide, especially under a Democratic administration, to go on for this long, for 14 months, you really have to have center-left buy-in. It's sort of like how the New York Times and the New Republic and the Atlantic magazine supporting the war in Iraq was high leverage versus, say, Fox News or George Will. That's kind of the general thesis of a lot of left-wing media criticism, as I'm sure you'll know, that you really need liberals to sell things to people, especially when there's a Democratic president doing it. And so our focus has been on that. Our first piece discussed the asymmetry of coverage and empathy and focus on CNN and MSNBC, which are kind of seen as broadly, I guess, center left for want of a better term. And then the next piece really detailed, which was less quantitative. So Othman did a bunch of really great data analysis in the first one. The second one was less quantitative, although it did have some source analysis, where we basically break down the three categories of genre and point out that they're tropes, that they're basically just empty. We make the argument that they're basically empty spin for the White House, and those three genres, which we can get into, are what we call helpless Biden, which is any report, analysis, or opinion that paints Biden as helpless. He kind of bumbles around. It's typically accompanied by a photo of him looking kind of sad, looking despondent. The second trope is fuming Biden, or deeply concerned Biden, which is any report, analysis, or opinion that paints Biden as secretly upset or outraged or always about to supposedly break with Netanyahu. There's been dozens of these articles. And the third trope is third partying, which is basically a way of framing the U.S. as a third party or kind of neutral humanitarian organization that's kind of on the sidelines with a clipboard, pushing for peace, but has no leverage over Israel. And we argue that these three tropes, and you'll see this often with the supposed ceasefire talks in Gaza, which are largely a myth, which we can get into as well. That removes the fact that the U.S. has dispositive leverage over Israel whenever it really wants to. And Biden just preemptively and very clearly said he was taking that off the table. So what we argue is that everything that follows from that is basically cosplay. It's not real. And that's what we laid out in our piece, I think, in pretty substantive detail. I mean, it's very long. We listed 10 different examples of each and did a source analysis, which is to say, where are these stories coming from? And 93, 97, and 98% of the sources are from anonymous Biden aides or pro-Biden people in the media or Israeli sources. So what we argue is that they are effectively White House curated, and to some extent Israeli curated stories to give the White House some breathing room and to separate them from the horrors people see every day on their social media timelines.
Do you see a bit of a through line from sort of I would say like the second Obama term, and how, I don't know, this is so long ago, I don't know if anyone even remembers this, but when the epithet emo prog was invented, it was invented because as a criticism of people who, pointed out that Gitmo hadn't been closed and were critics of Obama's drone war and his general foreign policy regime. Back then, the way that they sold all that was through like a false sense of savvy. It was attractive for like, Vox writers or just like random Democratic sympathetic people on the internet to believe that they had more of a handle on these things than other people.
Yeah, it's the Green Lantern, Ezra Klein. What do you think they can just, up and change the world overnight? And it's like, no, what? I didn't say that. They just have leverage and they don't use it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the textbook here, the playbook was written with Saudi Arabia. In fact, I even wrote about it with respect to Biden in Saudi Arabia the year before, or the April or May of 2023, before October 7th, which is what they did for Saudi Arabia for years. Like under Obama. They didn't do it under Trump because, again, Trump doesn't need this feigned helplessness and this feigned kind of liberal hand-wringing. It's not part of the brand. But Obama did this with Saudi Arabia. There was this, changing things from the inside. If we break from them, they'll go to China. We have to sell them more precise weapons. This was a big propaganda push by CSIS, which is a weapons contractor-funded think tank. This idea that like we can give them better, more precise weapons, as if the civilian deaths in Yemen were being caused by too indiscriminate of weapons, rather than the fact of Saudi Arabia wanting to destroy Yemenis people and the opposition in Yemen. So it's a playbook we've seen before, but I think after October 7th, it really, especially after it the first few months, it really, really took off. There was this whole media ecosystem built around feigned helplessness and also this kind of other super savvy idea that Biden was actually changing them from the inside. That there was a strategy. He was mitigating the extremes within Israel and was going to change them from the inside. But people kind of gave up on that after a few months because it stopped being credible. And they don't really try that much anymore these days. But that was very popular in November and December. That there was this super secret plan that you just didn't know about, and it was going to somehow lead to a ceasefire or some kind of a cessation of hostilities, and of course it never did.
Othman, let me ask you, like you mentioned in the part one of this series, you talk about, like, as a media researcher, the ways in which, like, some of the strategies that are employed to engender sympathy for the Israeli point of view and to, like, basically completely abstract Palestinian death and suffering. Like, when you take all of this in whole, what are some of the sort of patterns that emerge in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a playbook for dehumanizing an entire population very quickly, very succinctly, very cohesively. The first thing that we saw, and I'm talking about this in a quantitative way, where you can actually look at numbers, not just a couple of headlines, where the wording has stretched the English language to its extremes. Headlines like "the bullet found its way to the child's head," not that kind of thing. And these are numbers that show that this has been consistent. The first thing is Palestinians constantly die, whereas the other side, Israeli soldiers even, are massacred, slaughtered, brutalized. And when we looked at the first 100 days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw the exact same thing happening with Ukrainians. They were massacred, brutalized. Even the word genocide, for instance, or war crime was mentioned, I think something like 1,500 times about Ukraine, only 92 times about Palestine. So that's the first thing you do to dehumanize a population. That's the first step in the process. The second thing is when you have to start saying, okay, well, there are an insane number of people that are being killed, and many of them are women and children. Then you start labeling things as Hamas run, so that even when you admit that people are dying, you're saying, well, but these numbers are coming from Hamas run the health ministry, and we show, and I think we talked about this in an earlier article, that the Guardian did a report on this, that there was a CNN memo that basically went out saying, anytime you report casualties inside Gaza, you have to say Hamas-run ministry rather. And if you look at the timeline, you see a huge spike of that term, Hamas-run Ministry of Health, claims that this many people died. Then the third thing you do, at that point, you're kind of into May, where we've kind of accepted that things are really, really bad. A lot of people are dying. It doesn't matter who's saying that they're dying. It's just terrible. At that point, what we saw is liberal media basically saying, well, yes, Israel is doing some pretty terrible things, but you, the reader, you, the global community, you, the ICJ, the ICC, you aren't the right venue to hold them accountable. And I'm sure you all saw that editorial that just came out from the Washington Post that basically said exactly that the ICC is not the right place to hold Israel accountable. They themselves are supposed to hold themselves accountable. And then to add insult to injury.
But like, what's left unsaid is what would be the correct venue to hold the violations of international law and the perpetrators accountable, if not the International Criminal Court.
In that article, they say that it's themselves. It's the Israelis themselves, because they have a judiciary that can hold themselves accountable.
Clearly.
So that's the argument. So those are basically the three things that we've seen over and over and over again. And then the last thing I'll say is that throughout the whole process, there's very little. I mean, you guys talk about this, I think, on the show more than I've seen anywhere else. But the fact that the Israelis are fighting a militant group that is actually fighting back and killing some of them, we don't really see that much. So what ends up happening is this very obfuscated war between Israel and this very strange group of people that are constantly doing bad things, but you don't see them. You don't see them fighting back. You don't see them killing Israelis, and they're all bad actors. They're a group of bad actors, whereas the Israelis are, even when they do horrible things, even when there's admissions of rape and of massacres, of bombings of hospitals, they're always being framed as small bad actors within a larger group of pretty good people. And I mean, I think the best way to put it to your audience, or in a way that your audience might appreciate it, is that the IDF, according to U.S. media throughout our research, we found is that they're basically like a Tulsa King villain. They fundamentally have a very good heart, but they just need a good talking to, and they need to be set straight. But in general, they're good people. They're doing the right thing.
I think, like, over the last year, and I'm speaking just anecdotally from the liberals in my life, who are relatives, family members, friends, etc., who I think are are decent, good-hearted people, and I think like there's been so many bad actors thus far that they do see it on the news and it horrifies them. But the leap that they really can't seem to make, and I think it's because they get all of their news from sources like the New York Times, is Adam, you talk in the helpless Biden sort of category, the distinction between can't and won't. And I think like even with a lot of media massaging, I think many people do understand how horrific what's happening in Gaza is and who's doing it. But however, what they don't understand is that it's the United States doing it. Could you talk about like the way in which the media acknowledges, they always say like, well, to be sure, everyone knows that we have a ton of leverage over Israel, but then it just stops there. Like, could you talk about the way in which like the U.S.'s role in this, and Biden in particular, the way he is constantly being portrayed like, I'm just looking here like at like some of the articles you cited, like this is David Sanger in the New York Times. This is from November 5th of last year. So like right in the immediate aftermath. White House frustrated by Israel's onslaught, but sees few options. Yeah. And then there's other headlines like the limits of U.S. power. Just how do they do this obfuscation about what Biden won't do versus what he apparently can't do?
Well, there's a lot that goes into this, right? There's an underlying kind of liberal chauvinist assumption that the U.S. does bad things always reluctantly. Like everyone else is ontologically evil, the U.S. does bad things when it's either forced to by the all-powerful Israel lobby, or they kind of have no choice, or they are doing it because of some meta strategy of the bear hug, right? Changing things from the inside. And so very early on, you saw this helpless Biden narrative, which flew in the face of everything that we knew about previous conflicts, right? You had Reagan told Israel to stop in 82, Bush told Israel to stop in 06, Biden told Israel to stop in 2021, that they have dispositive leverage over Israel, something that Israeli generals routinely admit to, which I detail in my piece, because I really had to kind of establish the axiom that this is largely a fiction. And even if you accept the fact that no matter what the U.S. does, Israel's going to keep fighting, even though it's physically impossible for them to resupply their own jets and repair and munitions, right? Even if you accept that premise, that it's still wrong to fund and arm a genocide, right? So the whole argument that it's somehow a non sequitur misses the larger point, which is, again, by that logic, the U.S. should be arming and funding Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Iran or China, right? I mean, the whole idea is absurd, but it's also just not true based on people who with intimate knowledge. And Bruce Weidel at the Brookings Institute has debunked this. The Financial Times, by no means a left-wing newspaper, very clearly said Biden can end Israel's onslaught whenever it wants to. And then the articles themselves will sort of concede that. It's very bizarre. They operate under this tautology where they'll say Biden can't do it. And then halfway through they'll say, to be clear, there's always like a sort of a to be sure paragraph where they say, he could do it, but he has. But then they'll say he has a very strong emotional attachment to Israel, and it's like, but that's not a reason why he can't. That's just reasserting the premise with different words. That's a tautology, and that I think is where a lot of the work is done. And again, a lot of it is because people have, and I'm writing a follow-up piece for the Real News about this week, where the headline is actually Biden supports the genocide in Gaza because he thinks he agrees with it. It's really that simple. And I go through some of the other excuses which we can get into, which is he's forced to by electoral politics, or he's forced to by the Israel lobby, which can veer into anti-Semitism, rather than he just mostly agrees with it. He may agree with some of the excesses, some of the branding. He may agree with the percentage of starving people he wants to be 10% lower, but he broadly thinks that the cost is worth it, and he broadly believes in the kind of supremacist ideology of apartheid and genocide. And I think that's this idea that he's, again, people develop parasocial relationships with electeds, right? Uncle Joe, Joe Biden of the Onion meme, Joe Biden of the AOC selfie, Joe Biden of the Parks and Rec cameo. We sort of can't imagine that he would support a genocide. It sort of doesn't compute. It violates, I think, a general feel-good premise about politics, and people want to feel good about politics. And I wrote about this when I reported for The Nation from the DNC, that it was, about 200 yards from the main events at the DNC, there was a group of doctors who were there begging for a ceasefire who had worked in Gaza, who described the most horrific things you could possibly imagine. And people didn't want to hear it. Their seminars had a few reporters, Ta-Nehisi Coates being one of them, and Democracy Now! But most media just didn't want to hear it. It ruined the vibes. It ruined the Brad Summer. It sort of doesn't compute. It fundamentally boils down to sort of self-perceptions about our own country and how good we are and how good liberal Democrats are. And it just doesn't really compute. And so you have this market then to build these elaborate moral ecologies where yeah, we're sending arms. Yes, if you look at the material facts, it looks very much like we're sending troops, intel, military support, aircraft carriers to support an ongoing genocide. But there's got to be some other element to it. And so then you reverse engineer this elaborate excuse-making regime to say, oh, well, he's actually powerless. Oh, well, he's secretly mad and changing it from the inside. Oh, he's actually pressuring them to reduce civilian casualties or other some such. And then if you read this reporting, as I detail, it mostly boils down to theory of mind, guesswork, palace intrigue, personality disputes, and just pure solipsism. And this is all to sort of ameliorate the cognitive dissonance of saying, well, this guy I like or the party I vote for supports genocide. And so there's a huge buyer's market for it over the last year. And people filled that market with all kinds of pseudo-journalism.
Othman, I misspoke. The first article I mentioned was from the Washington Post, but this is David Sanger on November 6th of 2023. Biden confronts the limits of U.S. leverage in two conflicts. What, like, in your research, this issue of the U.S.'s leverage, and as Adam mentioned, our huge amount of military aid and the fact that we're basically the only country backstopping this is mentioned, but then waved away. What is the strategy for which they say, well, of course the U.S. has leverage, but obviously everyone sensible knows we're never going to use it. So that's just not a factor in the sort of discussion or the sort of consequences of this. What are some of the strategies the media employs to sort of acknowledge this leverage, but then pretend that it doesn't exist?
I think it's exactly that. There's been a lot of reporting, including in that article, and then our most recent article, in which we show that the Israelis themselves say, without the American, spigot, we would not be able to continue this war. So I think like you said, everyone agrees, everyone acknowledges that this is the case. I think the problem is that they stop right there, and there's really no further justification for why we continue doing this, other than what Adam just said, which is that he agrees. I mean, he agrees. Maybe the White House doesn't agree in its totality, but that is the case. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me, I don't believe that this made it into the article, but Biden, especially in the beginning of the war, he blatantly lied. He said, there were two examples that I remember very well, which are one, he said, I never really thought, this is the quote, I never really thought that I would see it and have it confirmed with pictures of terrorists beheading children. He acknowledged that he saw pictures of children being killed and beheaded. And then the only way that the New York Times and the Washington Post, in a couple of articles after this happened, is they went back and they said, and the White House walked back those claims. So the president lied about seeing something, and the White House really all they had to do was kind of walk back those claims. There's no holding him accountable. There's no questioning that line of thinking. And then the second one is when he went up and said that he has no notion that Palestinians are telling the truth. And this line specifically appeared once in one New York Times article that was kind of a live article. It wasn't even its own thing. And then it never appeared again. So we have two statements from the president saying things that we know are factually false. And the US media did not challenge him on those ones. So when we go to the more abstract things like, do we have leverage or do we not have leverage? It becomes a lot easier for them to not respond to them because they didn't respond to this very blatant lie.
And then, of course, he lied about the death count several times. Calling into question the quote-unquote Hamas-run ministry, even though the State Department themselves have used those figures for years. The CIA and Israeli intelligence use those figures, and everyone agrees they're certainly an undercount. Because that's not, again, if people want to question whether or not there's a motivated reasoning behind a source of a death count, by all means they can, but this is a source that have been credible for years. Human Rights Watch has verified them. After 2014, Operation Protective Edge, the Israeli military did its own findings of how many people were killed in Gaza, which was, I think, roughly 1,523, and found that the difference between the Israeli figures and the so-called Hamas-run ministry was less than 7%. It was 6.7% difference. So these are not meaningful differences. Everybody knew those death figures were correct and an understatement because they have to be verified. This didn't include people in rubble. This didn't include people dying of preventable disease, etc. And Biden straight up said, they're lying. I don't believe it. John Kirby repeated this several times. Outright, genocide denial. And then people just kind of shrugged and moved on. And then later in some supposedly meeting with quote unquote Muslim leaders, he walked it back and said he apologized for it. That's a third party claim. But so this is what they've kind of been doing from the beginning, which is the most, again, we have them boosting the fake UNRWA, Hamas claims that ended up not being true. They boosted the Al-Shifa hospital, Bond villain layer under the Al-Shifa hospital in November of 2023, which ended up not being true. False claim after false claim. This White House has promoted, pushed, lent quote unquote U.S. intelligence support of, and ended up not showing any information verifying it or later walking it back. It's been lie after lie after lie after lie. It's been little mini WMD every few weeks. And they just get away with it. And then people act like they're somehow separate from what's going on. And of course, none of this is possible without their full-blown support.
You've previously asked Netanyahu to minimize civilian casualties. Do these numbers say to you that he is ignoring that message?
What they say to me is I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
I mean, like a key point in this piece, and this is just a key thing to understand about this conflict, is that the United States could stop this if they wanted to, and they could stop it tomorrow. And I don't think there is no counter argument to that. But I think the harder and more difficult question, and I think this gets to this mental block that a lot of otherwise well-meaning liberals have, is that it doesn't account for like Adam, you said, he's not stopping them because he agrees with them. He supports this policy. I think for liberals, the question that's difficult to answer, or that why that seems incorrect, is that they don't have an explanation for why he supports this policy. And maybe this is asking too much to psychoanalyze someone like Joe Biden. But if you had to venture a guess or provide an explanation as to why he continues this policy, you can say, it's his emotional ties to Israel. But does that really capture it?
I think he's an ideological Zionist. I think there's a lot of confusion about what Zionism is. And again, I write about this in a separate piece that's coming out soon, which is, again, I think if Joe Biden was Jewish, people wouldn't really have wouldn't have a hard time understanding this. But because he's Catholic, people always assume there's some dark secret, cabal forcing him to have these positions. And Zionism is an ideology that's as American as apple pie. It is a colonial ideology. It is central to our own founding mythologies. And so, yeah, there are other factors. Yes, again, he would not have risen to his level of support in politics had it not been for his lockstep support of Israel and the support of the Israel lobby. Again, the Israel lobby spent millions of dollars on ads in the 2020 primary, attacking Bernie Sanders in South Carolina, Nevada, and Iowa because they trusted Biden more on Israel. So it's not like he hasn't had support from the Israel lobby, but this is someone who's a lame duck president. Right after the election, what did he do? He blew the remainder of his capital on sending another $680 million to Israel, insulting the ICC, discrediting the ICC, and after their arrest warrant was announced. And lobbying against senators who were opposing another weapons sale to Israel. So he's clearly committed. He clearly believes it. And I don't think there's really much beyond that. I think, he's a stubborn old man. This is what he believes. And everything else kind of worked backwards from there. Again, to the extent to which there's been pushback from, say, quarters of the CIA or David Ignatius of the Washington Post, it's mostly about the excesses of the bombing. It's about the kind of the raw brutality of it and how it's bad for the brand, how it's bad for the kind of imperial brand. And I think that's a legit vector of pushback, but ultimately it's just what he thinks. And I think that it doesn't really have to get much more complicated than that. Because again, this is not someone with anything to gain at this point. He's a lame duck and he's spending his remaining time pushing it. And to some extent, I think he's kind of pot committed. And I think very early on, they did corner themselves rhetorically and ideologically by saying we have to defeat Hamas, quote unquote, defeat Hamas, which is of course impossible. You can't defeat, guerrilla militaries with some degree of popular support. It's impossible. It's always going to be genocidal, and everybody knew that from October 8th on. So I think that's kind of it's really that simple. He sort of just agrees, and maybe that seems a little pat, but I don't think you really need much else as an explanatory mechanism. And this goes into the kind of ceasefire talks, which I think is really what you were getting at when you talk about how liberals begin to understand or sort of compartmentalize. Because what they did, again, from the first few months, they banned, the State Department issued a memo, Secretary of State Blinken issued a memo banning State Department and White House employees from using the word ceasefire, because everybody knew what it meant in the context of Gaza. It wasn't this kind of mysterious thing. And then in the eve of the Michigan primary in February, they basically co-opted the term to make it mean something else. They made it what used to be a temporary pause for the purposes of hostage exchanges, with an understanding that they would continue the so-called war on Hamas and defeat, quote unquote, defeat Hamas. And once I think they began doing that in March and April of 2024, I think that's when a lot of the heat came off, because then they could do what they did with the two-state solution, which is appeal to this nebulous process, which exists solely to get liberals off their back. It is there to make liberals feel good about themselves, because, it's not apartheid, right? It's not a military occupation of the West Bank or a sieging and bombing and occupation of Gaza. They're just working on a two-state solution. There's a peace process they're working on. And even though it's been 70 years or 40 years, wherever you want to start the clock, 60 years, they're working on it. They're going to get around to it. And the ceasefire, quote unquote, ceasefire talks began to sort of serve the same role. It's something that liberals could point to. It's something that DNC speakers could point to and say, well, look, they're, quote unquote, tirelessly working for a ceasefire. It became this thingamajig. You could sort of gesture towards to avoid the difficult questions about U.S. support for a genocide.
Trust the process, people. To go into the second category of fuming Biden, and this is one of my favorite, because there have been dozens of these articles over the last year.
And Vaughn, we're also learning about how President Biden discussed with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a whole series of issues.
Exactly. There was distinct frustration earlier this year, this spring, in which he used a pejorative or a vulgarity to describe Bibi Netanyahu. Of course, this has been a tense relationship, him referring to Netanyahu as a bad guy.
Most of them written by one man, Barak Ravid. What can you tell us about Barak Ravid, who he is, and this strange tempo with which he is the sole author of piece after piece after piece, which really contain no news outside of this idea that Joe Biden is mad?
Yeah, he works for Axios. He won a White House correspondence award for supposedly writing journalism that makes people feel like they're in the room. I counted over 24 versions of this. He's a former member of an Israeli information unit in the IDF, and he has a lot of contacts in Israeli military and intelligence because he used to work for them. And he has written, and again, I think my count was low. I had a pretty high threshold, but he's written dozens of these stories about how the U.S. about how Biden was about to break with Netanyahu, and it's always this just around the corner thing. It's this constant it's kind of like Gilligan's Island, sort of always about to get off the island but never do in every episode. And so he's written, quote, that Biden was, quote, breaking with Netanyahu, quote, increasingly frustrated, quote, running out of patience, quote, deeply concerned. This is the same article written over and over again. And the analogy we make is it's like in Theater 101, they teach you the difference between a sketch and a plot. A plot moves forward, it has beat changes, its characters evolve, whereas a sketch is the same gag 3 or 4 times to sort of draw out the absurdity, and then you move on. And these fuming Biden stories are basically just a sketch. They're the same. He's sort of vaguely mad. There's never any change in policy. There's never a beat change. Nothing ever escalates. It's a sketch, but it's a sketch that's gone on for 14 months over dozens and dozens of articles. And you would think after the 500th person who wrote it, their editor would be like, does this mean anything? Is this news? Or is there any way to verify this? Is there a hidden camera on the side of the White House showing him actually upset? Or is this just what his aides are telling us because that's what they want us to write?
I mean, you mentioned that Barak Ravid is very celebrated because he makes you feel like you're in the room. Well, I mean, I don't know what goes on in that room, but just saying reporting on these phone calls or whatever, but then nothing ever changes. The impression that's given, and I know the utility of these pieces, once again, is managing the perception of Democratic voters and liberals who might otherwise be questioning, hey, why is Joe Biden letting this happen? Well, no, he's letting it happen, but he's very mad about it. But isn't the knock-on effect of dozens of these articles over a year just essentially giving the impression that Joe Biden is totally impotent? And once again,
they don't care. Liberals, as you know, liberals would much rather be seen as incompetent and bumbling than evil. That is their preferred. And I write about this as well. It's the politics of feigned powerlessness. They're always kind of bumbling around. Nobody's in charge. No, there's no real manager in charge. They don't know what's going on. They're just a humanitarian organization. They're sort of always asking you for help. It's part of a broader regime of politics of feigned powerlessness, because if you assert you have power, then and you have agency, then you're held accountable for things. But if you're constantly bumbling around and being pushed around by Netanyahu, you're not really accountable for anything, either morally, socially, or politically. And so I think that's really, people say, well, this makes Biden look weak. And it's like, yeah, he doesn't care. Like, liberals don't care. They would much rather look weak and ineffective, because then they're not accountable for anything, rather than looking like they support something which I think everybody knows is objectively bad and evil. So yeah, I think the knockdown effect is it does begin to erode like confidence in politicians in general, because it's like, well, why does it matter who I vote for president if the president is seemingly incapable of keeping a client state in line?
Now onto the third category of sort of third partying. Adam, you write that this is a strategy that would be familiar to anyone involved in labor negotiations, because you talk about like how positioning the United States as a neutral third party in, let's say, a ceasefire negotiation, like how that functions and like what the sort of script is for that line.
Yeah. So in whenever there's an anti-labor campaign, the first thing that corporations do is they do what's called third partying the union driving effort. They say they treat unions not as outgrowths or representatives of workers, but a third party that's come in to sort of soak off your checks and come between you and the employee, your benevolent employee. And so a kind of like bizarro evil version of this is the U.S., Biden and the media in general, third partying the U.S. and framing it not as a active participant in the conflict, right? The people providing the bombs, killing 99% of the people, providing military support, intelligence, cover at the UN, threats to the ICC. But again, once they co-opted the ceasefire narrative and began to warp the definition, they positioned themselves as an agent of peace. And this is what I think really upset a lot of people when Ocasio-Cortez did her tirelessly working for a ceasefire. Is it perpetuated this idea that not only is the U.S. not an agent of violence and genocide and that needs to be stopped, it rendered all the protesters outside and all the protests a non sequitur. Because why would you protest Harris and Biden if they're actually working tirelessly for a ceasefire? It makes sense, right? And you see this repeatedly, this kind of, the U.S. is not only not participating in arming a genocide, but they are in fact doing the opposite. They're an agent of peace who are simply unable to keep their ally in line. And so you see a Financial Times headline from October 29th, 2024 that reads, quote, Gaza aid falls to lowest level since start of war despite U.S. warning to Israel, unquote. But the warning is fake. The warning is not real. The U.S. could compel Israel to let in aid whenever it wants. They are not doing it in spite of the U.S. They're doing it because of the U.S., because the U.S. is the one supporting the starvation regime and the starvation campaign, which we know is going on because internal memos within the State Department have been saying it for months. And so, again, the media constantly frames the U.S. as this mitigating humanitarian force. It's this passive, neutral party, rather than someone who's actively participating in the conflict. And that is by design. That is how it is pitched to the media, and that is how the media has largely adopted it. And it is a total fiction. It is not a representation of reality.
An example that you said from this is Peter Baker writing in the New York Times on August 29th of 2024. Headline is, Biden team sees narrow window for deal on ceasefire and hostages in Gaza. And I just want to read this paragraph here. As if the diplomatic Rubik's Cube were not intricate enough, though, a new wrinkle in recent days has threatened to further complicate the American efforts. Israeli officials are worried that the International Criminal Court is preparing to issue arrest warrants for senior government officials stemming from the conduct of the war in Gaza. Othman, let me ask you, like, now that these arrest warrants have been issued, have you been noticing any new strategies or employment of similar tropes to help to sort of craft like a narrative that like Israel's being singled out, or like that like you said before, that this isn't the right venue and this is actually making the conflict, like, this is actually prolonging the conflict? Like how have you read the media's reaction to these arrest warrants being issued?
I mean, one of the problems with what we do is if we look at, or at least from my side of things, which is, data collection and analysis, is that it's always retroactive. So it's less about looking at what's coming out today and more about what's been happening over the last week or so. But still, I can say that what I've been seeing is basically different variations of what we just saw. So it can range from, this is anti-Semitic, because it's anti-Semitic and it's, anti-Israel because we're doing it to Israelis and not to, a general in Myanmar or to a Sudanese warlord or to Bashar al-Assad. I think that's the first part, and then all the way to, well, this is kind of good, but it's not really going to have the intended impact. So even if we are going to, arrest them, this is only going to make them angrier. This is only going to make them more violent. So that's the spectrum of what we've seen. But in neither case is it a celebration of, finally something has come up that has shown that that people can be held accountable for their actions.
Yeah, one thing is the ICC had no choice, really. I mean, that's the thing. From its inception in 2002 to 2022, 47 out of the 47 public indictments that the ICC issued were against Africans. It wasn't until Russia invaded Ukraine that they indicted a non-African, and that, of course, was Russia, which is an enemy of the West. So had they sort of let this genocide play out in 8K for this long without an arrest, and of course they balanced it out with trying to arrest whoever's left in Hamas, right? Because most of them have been killed in terms of the leadership. They had to do something. It would have been, they've been called the International Caucasian Court for years. Their hypocrisy has been fairly obvious. And this is the Washington Post effectively made this argument in plain English. They said, oh, the ICC is not used for Israel and Western allies. It's used for baddie countries. It's supposed to be an instrument of U.S. imperialism. So at least in some level, I appreciate the honesty. So they kind of had to do it. And I think Othman's right. The reaction then ranges from, and this is the White House's response, which is they didn't dispute the substance of what the ICC claimed at all. They made a process criticism. They even used the word process and said they didn't have jurisdiction, which is not usually how one sort of conveys their innocence, right? If I'm caught stealing something and running out of a CVS with a bunch of shampoo bottles in my bag, I don't say, well, cop, you're not supposed to be on this beat. You're supposed to be over there. I mean, that would not be a very credible defense. And so that's pretty much all they got. They don't really have much left. The sort of so-called liberal rules-based order is increasingly discredited, and I think the ICC had to do something without seeming nakedly racist and hypocritical.
I mean, I think it's interesting in the argument that goes that this is wrong because Israel is being singled out, that they're being held to a double standard. And I think that that's a very telling argument because it's one that completely and totally concedes that they are in fact doing the exact things that get other countries in trouble in the International Criminal Court. But it's unfair because they're the ones getting called to account for it. Like, have you noticed any similar line of argument as it regards Israel's somehow being unfairly targeted by this?
Yeah, that's a traditional. I mean, I can read you from a Christian Science Monitor op-ed from October of 1989, quote, "South Africa shouldn't be singled out," unquote, where they go through and pretty much give every single Zionist argument. The blacks in South Africa have more freedom than other parts. There's war criminals and human rights violations in neighboring countries. I mean, it's literally just the same talking points, but replace Israel with South Africa. And you can read that op-ed on Christian Science Monitor from 1986. So these are well-worn. The idea that, like, if evil is taking place in the world anywhere at any time, like, until all of that evil is solved and the perpetrators brought to justice, perhaps then could Israel be fairly, you can notice the terrible things they're doing. But, like, as long as evil exists in the world elsewhere, it's unfair to criticize Israel for the evil things that they do. The ICC is jurisdictional, too, because the ICC, the only reason why they were even permitted to intervene here is because Palestine in 2015, the only good thing that Mahmoud Abbas ever did was get Palestine to sign the ICC. So Palestine's an ICC member, therefore they have jurisdiction when Israel invades Palestine, as they have in the West Bank and Gaza. So they do have jurisdiction, where many of the other counterexamples people say it really is a jurisdictional issue. They're either kind of internally oppressive, so therefore there's no like sort of relevant party. So again, they're just grasping at straws. They're not disputing the substance of the claim. They're simply resorting to these hypocrisy mongering or tu quo nonsense. So it's really just a sign of desperation. But yeah, I mean but in the U.S. made the same argument. They're saying it's a jurisdictional issue, but again, I don't think anyone takes that seriously.
And I think one thing to add is that we built this database to basically be able to do our own research, and we're going to make it public so that anyone can do this type of research. But one thing that to note is that there's 20,000 articles from the beginning of from October 7th until I think basically July 30th or so. So 20,000 articles being published mostly by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I think the third largest was probably AP, followed by USA Today. So we're only talking about 4 or 5 outlets that are publishing constantly about this issue, and so they really don't need to convince you of anything. They just need to convince you that things are happening slowly but surely. You don't need to worry about it, and by tomorrow,
Right.
you've already forgotten about it, and another 10 or 15 new articles have come up about the topic. And the genocide is unfolding so quickly that they really don't need you to be. You cannot keep up with the news, and so even when there's a point at which a president lies, even when they say genocidal claims, even when the ICC reports on something like this, even a ceasefire is going to be forgotten by tomorrow. And the U.S. media, or at least the liberal media that we focused our research on, is not in the business of trying to hold on to a major story and then continuously report on it. It will forget very quickly, and it's almost on purpose.
Another line of argument that I've seen crop up over the last couple of months, but definitely in the last week or so. I'm quoting White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, who said, "There is no equivalence between Hamas and Israel," except she didn't say equivalence, she said evidence in the press briefing, which I thought was a really telling Freudian slip. But taking it as read that there's no equivalence between Hamas and Israel. Well, I would agree with that, just not in the way that they intend. But Adam, what do they mean when they say that there can be no Now, to be sure, there can be no equivalence between Hamas and Israel.
I mean,
Israel is a democracy.
This is just desperation. It doesn't even make sense based on its own logic. It's just one of these thought memes, because what they did this when they first announced the ICC, and they do this when Human Rights Watch issues a report where they criticize Hamas and then they criticize Israel. The first response is, "Oh, how dare you throw them in the same lot? They're not the same," which is again just this kind of pat chauvinist thing you say. But again, the ICC didn't say that. Even if you sort of accept that logic, that's not what Human Rights Watch reports say. They don't make any kind of qualitative or even quantitative comparison. They're just saying our job is in this conflict is to report what we view as war crimes based on X, Y, and Z. Here's the war crimes Israel did. Here's the war crimes that Hamas did on October 7th. You can sort of take that and do what you want with that. There's a sort of bizarre idea that they're making an equivalency argument, but they're not, even by their own logic. And again, you can look at the death count and then realize there's not really any equivalency, but that's not really what they mean. It's just again, they have 4 or 5 of these talking points they just throw out because they kind of sound superficially appealing, but nobody really believes them. These guys have been in zombie mode for months. They all know what they're doing is evil. They know it's not true. They know it's disingenuous, but they're careerists, and they sort of they just want to get out as soon as they can to then go work at McDonald's and Amazon and Uber.
Well, now that they all will be doing that very shortly, as soon as January turns around, I guess I'm wondering, how you see, how do you anticipate the media changing their strategy? Because surely these horrors will continue to persist under a Trump administration, but it will be happening under an administration for which absolutely nobody expects them to respect international law or the lives of Palestinians, at least as far as their voters or the media outlets that favor them. So all these strategies that we've talked about on this episode, essentially are strategies for dealing with something like a Democratic president doing a genocide. Do you expect the media to change tactics or begin to notice things that they otherwise would ignore when it's a Republican authoring all of these great evils? Or do you think it will just be more of the same? Or
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I've thought about. And we do have a little bit of an apples to apples with how Yemen was covered, because Yemen began under Obama in March of 2015. He left office in January of 2017. And then when Trump came in office, a lot of the people working, many of whom I know personally, on ending the U.S. support of the bombing of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and U.S. support for it, did say that they had a lot easier time getting Democratic buy-in because it was under a Republican president, but it still wasn't enough. And it wasn't really till Biden's second year that they reached a kind of ceasefire and there was enough pressure. And at that point, they had destroyed so much of Yemen, there really wasn't much left to do. Also, Saudi Arabia was losing the war. It's one of the reasons they agreed to a ceasefire, is that Yemen found a way to blow up their oil refineries. So there's a little bit of a historical analogy. But yes, all the kind of liberal hand-wringing won't be there. I think to some extent they'll still try it. What's interesting is that when when Kamala Harris at the DNC used the term Palestinian, I think she used like Palestinian self-determination and freedom, and people said, "Oh, her rhetoric's changed." There's actually almost a verbatim copy of Rex Tillerson, the former Obama, or rather Trump Secretary of State. Trump, again, when he kind of lets, Rubio may use some of that rhetoric, but no, there'll be more hardcore, more right wing, less sort of precious about all the liberal pretense, and that'll go away. Whether or not it'll embolden Congress to sort of oppose it, to be honest, probably not. It probably won't really matter. I think it's mostly bipartisan. I think that much of the kind of rigmarole and theater will go away, but the fundamental policies will be more or less the same.
Yeah, and I don't think that the reporting on the president and the administration might change significantly from the MSNBC and CNN and New York Times and Washington Post. But I don't know. I mean, I think there really has not been a time in American history where Palestinians have not been vilified in the news, or where they have not been dehumanized beyond worse than really any other population in modern history. I don't think that that's going to change in any way significantly. I think children are still not going to be mentioned as often. I think the genocide is not going to be talked about as a genocide. I don't see those things changing at all.
And thinking about this, and I'm just like trying to imagine like how people will understand this like 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And the only thing I have to compare it to is the war in Iraq, which like, I guess now everyone agrees was a mistake, an oopsie, or just maybe well-intentioned, but handled incompetently. Do you think that there will be like a similar, like as this disaster unfolds, do you think we'll ever get to the point where everyone will pretend like that they were opposed to this from the beginning, or that like it was just a regrettable error in judgment?
I think the bumbling empire routine is the reason why that's so popular is because it's a way of kind of preventing that before it starts, right? Like those who owned Iraq, you had to vote on it, you had to sort of defend it. It was a little bit more demonstrable. The way the U.S. has supported this genocide is because it is so shrouded in these genres, in this kind of metaphysical debates about who's influencing who and the reluctant Biden, the helpless Biden. I think it kind of gives them enough distance. And I think that the reason why these aides are so eager to run to the New York Times and Politico and Axios to paint this narrative of helplessness and secretly working behind the scenes is because they very well know, and they knew very early on, that this was going to be a stain on this administration and on their careers. And they needed something to point to and say, well, we tried to get a ceasefire. Israel just wouldn't listen. We did our best. And then they did this very perverse kind of Karl Rovian inversion where not only were they not supporting a genocide, but they actually became an agent of peace, of mitigation, of humanitarianism. The humanitarian peer, we could do a whole nother hour on all the sort of high level headline grabbing gimmicks they did. Dropping in aid through airplanes, the least efficient way of doing it. All these kind of pseudo.
Remember the pier?
The pier, all that. And they did those things because I think they just wanted to get protests off their back, progressive groups off their back. But I think in some ways they did it because cynically they were worried about their own careers. But I think they are also worried about the morale of the State Department. I mean, again, you had tons of people writing dissent memos, lots of people quitting. Everybody knew what they were doing was evil. And they just needed to have a little bit of wiggle room morally to say, well, this is kind of separate from me. And so these elaborate pseudo narratives began to emerge around that to distance themselves from the horrors of Gaza. And I think they were largely successful. I think starting in the spring of 2024, when they began to co-opt and subvert the concept of a ceasefire, I think that's really when they began to sleep better at night, because then they could again appeal to this kind of nebulous process and say, well, we're actually trying to stop it. We just can't.
So like in 20, 30 years time, these people, if they're still around, can point to this period now and say, we were working tirelessly for a ceasefire and we just couldn't get it done. And I feel very bad about that.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's, again, to some extent, it's worked really well. I think along with the suppression of protest movements by right-wing, state legislators, police, and university officials, and the sort of, pretty sophisticated doxing and life-ruining system in place, they've really done a good job suppressing meaningful dissenting criticism around this. And you see that reflected in the diminishing of protests this fall. And I think that the fake ceasefire stuff was a huge part of that. The sort of feigned helplessness was a huge part of that.
Just one more thing I'm going to as a comparison to the Iraq war, because I remember when, the WMD propaganda was in full swing. There were journalists working in mainstream American institutions who more or less got that story correct in real time. And they're largely forgotten about because they never gained any purchase. I'm thinking about I forget the names of the reporters who were working for McClatchy, I believe, who basically debunked Saddam is seeking nuclear weapons or has an active nuclear weapons program, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering, are there any examples in the American press of journalists or institutions who have done good work on the Gaza war crimes or just like the horrors of Gaza?
I will say, as it pertains to precisely the helpless Biden trope, I will say that Bloomberg News has not really fallen for it. They have some like vaguely helpless Biden headlines, but when you read the article, they're kind of like a very scathing criticism of that framing. So I would say the one that I repeatedly would look at and be like, oh, I'm going to nail these guys. And I would read it and I'd say, actually, no, this is kind of not doing that. Would be Bloomberg News.
And Othman, in your research, are there any silver linings? Are there any counterexamples that you can cite of journalists who are not just mainlining this propaganda?
Not really. Outside of the outlets that we look at often, which are the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, and the biggest 4 or 5 outlets, there are many. And The Intercept and Drop Site, many other independent news outlets are good on this. They do their research, they do their investigative. ProPublica has actually been quite good on this.
I would say, sorry, if I can interject real quick, I would say that Evan Hill at the Washington Post has been doing a lot of debunking.
That's a great point.
He was central to the debunking the Al Shifa hospital bullshit, and he's done some really good stuff. So he's kind of a rare exception. And even Jonathan Hudson's decent on it, even though he did a couple of the bumbling Biden stuff, he's been okay too. So I to be fair, but everyone else has been pretty much dog shit, especially the New York Times. New York Times has been horrible.
Yeah, one guy, the fact checker for the Washington Post, Glenn Kessler, is in some ways he has been good. He hasn't done that much work, but some of the fact checking that he's done on Biden, basically saying, like I said, outright lies. He has done it. He has said, the president did not. He said he saw something, and then later on, turns out he didn't see it. But at no point does he actually hold anyone to account. It's just kind of what we said before, which is stating the fact that something, there was an error made instead of, there was an active attempt to lie about something. So, yeah, with the exception of Evan Hill, I think there's very, very few.
I mean, despite these counterexamples, and the counterexample of the whole non-English media would be, another big counterexample.
Right. Al Jazeera has been obviously not doing this, right?
But the thing is, even if in the American press, if facts are recorded or stated, that's very different than it becoming a story. And I guess my question is what is the strategy or methods by which certain facts can be stated, recorded, and then contained and not becoming part of a narrative or a story? Because all of the examples we've been using of these, the frauds that are perpetrated, it seems like they gain the purchase of they have a narrative. There's an arc there's a story that people are given, but that's independent of facts that may, while recorded, nonetheless never really penetrate or never pass through this membrane of media, follow up or making it a story. Do you get the sense of what I'm saying? Or do you notice a way in which stories are interjected in the absence or in spite of facts that contradict them?
It's because there's no moral decision making going on, and this is part of a broader issue, which is called the natural disasterizing of Gaza. If you see the way the New York Times covers it, even when they occasionally will do sympathetic coverage of victims in Gaza, it is treated like a hurricane. It is treated like an earthquake. It is quote, war has ravaged Gaza or conflict. It's not Israel, right? There's a removal of moral agency repeatedly. And again, it's not something you ever see with how they cover Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's Russia bombs hospital. Russia uses weapon starvation as a weapon. So the agency is just constantly removed from this so-called conflict. And so I think that just abstracts it out to where it's what Adam Curtis calls oh dearism. It's this you look at it and you see these poor injured and suffering children and you say, oh dear. And it's not a particular policy. It's not a choice anyone really made. Again, no one's really in charge. No one knows where the manager is. And that's the kind of that's really all you can do when you look at how manifestly horrific this is all you can do is evade responsibility. And if liberalism has done one thing over the last year, liberal media and liberal institutions, it is an elaborate responsibility avoidance machine. That is all it is. It is about not finding anyone in charge who's responsible.
You mentioned that this is part 2 of a series. Othman, you mentioned that you're working on making this database that you're drawing your research from public. I mean, what further plans do you have for this kind of research and like in this ongoing series? Could you talk a little bit about just what's coming up next, or where you're turning your attention to now?
Yeah. So the goal of the project was basically, we're all chronically on Twitter all the time, and we see people screenshot images of bad headlines, or they copy and paste something from the Washington Post or the New York Times that says something horrendous. And so we know that there is bias. We know that there's dehumanization. We haven't seen it quantitatively, except in a couple of instances. And we're by no means the only people doing this, but I think we're doing it systematically, and we're trying to be as thorough as possible. So the goal ultimately is to have a way for any researcher. And the reason why we started doing this was after we published the Intercept piece, we got hundreds of requests from researchers, university professors, graduate students, podcasters, independent journalists wanting access to this data. The data being basically a way to search through tens of thousands of articles from liberal news outlets. And the goal is that once you are able, an editor or a journalist or a reporter can very easily can defend themselves when you point to one headline that looks wonky. They can't really do that when you have empirical evidence that shows that they dehumanize Palestinians, that they only mention the word. For instance, I think when we did the one on for the Intercept, we found that in 1,100 articles or so, the word children referring to Palestinians only appeared in 2 headlines. And then by that point, 6,000 children had been killed in Gaza. And so there really is no fighting the truth at that point. And so that's the first part, is you can actually have, we're arming researchers with the ammo to be able to make their point and prove it. And then the second thing is that we're proving while we do this, that it's not just one reporter or one editor or one outlet. It's widespread. It's consistent. There's an active editorial choice to dehumanize an entire population consistently. And really there's no relief. Sometimes you'll find articles and pieces, editorials that will be, slightly more, let's say, two-sided, but they are very quickly followed by 10 or 15 new articles that are absolutely horrible. So the goal of this is to continue doing this. We so far we have some, like I said, about 20,000 articles between October 7th and July 30th of 2024. I think we're going to continue until this genocide ends, and we're going to make it public to any researcher that wants access to it.
All right. Well, Adam Johnson, Othman Ali, I want to thank you so much for your work. I want to thank you for the Nation article. Adam Johnson, of course, Citations Needed. I doubt our listeners need to be cajoled into subscribing, but we will have a link up to the Nation article and for Citations Needed in the episode description. Once again, Adam and Othman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.